Today, we're going to unpack the incredible story of how India's constitution came to be. And let me tell you, it's a heck of a journey, spanning empires, rebellions, and the absolutely tireless work of some true visionaries. So let's dive in and see how a nation's founding document was forged over 2 long centuries. So, have you ever stopped to think about it? How was a constitution actually born? You might imagine it's written in some flash of inspiration, a single brilliant moment of creation. Well, not usually. For a lot of nations, it's a long winding road, full of experiments, failures, and slow, hard-won progress. And for India, our story kicks off right here, in 1765. At this point, India was this complex patchwork of kingdoms. But there was one entity whose influence was just exploding, a British trading corporation called the East India Company. And believe it or not, this is our starting point for a process that took nearly 200 years to turn a colony into a sovereign republic. All right, Act 1. This is all about the huge shift from a private company running a subcontinent, which is just wild to think about, to the direct rule of the British Empire. And you can bet this was not a smooth handover. It was born out of total chaos. You see, by the late 1700s, the East India Company was acting less like a business and more like a rogue state. It was getting out of control. So the British Parliament finally stepped in with the Regulating Act of 1773. And what's so crucial here is that this was the very first time London tried to put a leash on the company. They created the post of Governor General of Bengal to try and centralize power. But, a leash wasn't nearly enough. The company's administration was just a mess. It was inefficient, corrupt, and completely disconnected from the people it was ruling. You could just feel this simmering tension about to boil over into a massive crisis. And boom, here's that breaking point. The Revolt of 1857 was absolutely seismic. It was this massive uprising that just blew the lid off the company's failures and sent shockwaves all the way back to London. After this, there was no going back. The old way of doing things was done. So in response, Parliament passed the Government of India Act of 1858. This act basically said, party's over. It dissolved the East India Company and transferred all its powers directly to the British Crown. A new role was created, the Secretary of State for India, based in London, officially kicking off the era we know as the British Raj. Now, in our next chapter, things start to evolve. For the very first time, we start to see Indian voices being included in the lawmaking process. Now, I have to stress, that inclusion was very limited, but hey, it was a start. What's really fascinating here is just how slow this change was. These Indian Council's acts were total baby steps. In 1861, a few Indians were nominated. Notice I said nominated, not elected, to the council. By 1892, we finally get a very limited, indirect form of elections. And then in 1909 comes a huge and really controversial change: separate electorates for Muslims. That was a policy that would have massive consequences down the road. And, to put a human face on this whole era, meet Satyendra Tagore. In 1863, this man became the first Indian ever to be selected for the super elite Indian civil service, what they called the steel frame of the British administration. He was a complete trailblazer, breaking into a system that was absolutely designed to be exclusively British. Okay, this brings us to the 20th century and to a single piece of legislation that was so huge, so comprehensive, it would basically become the structural blueprint for India's future constitution. The Government of India Act of 1935 was an absolute mammoth. Seriously, it was the longest, most detailed act the British Parliament had ever produced. And that alone tells you just how complex governing India had become and how loud the demands for self-rule were getting. So, what did this beast of an act actually do? Well, here's one of its most important legacies. It created a federal structure, dividing powers between the central government and the provinces. You had 3 lists: a federal list for the center, a provincial list, and a concurrent list for things they could both legislate on. Now, if this looks familiar, it should. This exact model was adopted by the independent Indian Constitution. But let's ask the big question. How democratic was this new system really? Well, this chart tells a pretty stark story. The 1935 Act did expand voting rights, but only to about 14% of the population. That means the vast majority, a whopping 86% of Indians, still had no voice, no vote. It was a step, for sure, but the road to true democracy was still a long one. And that brings us to our final act, the climax of the story. This is the moment when Indian leaders finally grab the pen and start writing their own destiny. You see, the call for a constitution written by Indians for Indians had been growing louder and louder for years. The idea of a constitutional assembly, a body elected for the single purpose of framing a constitution, was first floated in 1934 and quickly became the official demand of the Indian National Congress. The goal was crystal clear: no more laws handed down from London. And wow, just listen to these words from Jawaharlal Nehru in 1946. They really capture the spirit of that moment, don't they? The resolution he presented wasn't just some dry plan, it was a declaration of intent. He was laying out the philosophy for a new nation, a sovereign, independent republic where all power comes from the people. But as the Constitution was finally being completed, its chief architect, the brilliant Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, didn't just offer a celebration. He offered a profound and very sober warning. In his final speech to the Assembly right before the Constitution was adopted, Dr. Ambedkar pointed to this deep contradiction at the heart of the new India. On one hand, the nation was about to grant political equality, one person, one vote. But on the other hand, it was doing so in a society that was still deeply fractured by social and economic inequality. And his crucial point was this: a political democracy built on a foundation of social hierarchy is a democracy in danger. He argued that just giving people the right to vote wasn't enough, not even close. True democracy, he said, also requires a real commitment to dismantling social and economic oppression. And that leaves us with this final, powerful question that echoes Dr. Ambedkar's warning all these years later. The Constitution provided this magnificent blueprint for equality and justice. But the actual work of building a society that lives up to those ideals, well, that's a journey that continues to this very day. So how does any nation close that gap between its beautiful ideals on paper and its messy reality on the ground? That, right there, remains the ultimate challenge.